Okay, the next thing is you need to find the best way of colouring for yourself. So you may hear a lot of people saying they colour light to dark, some saying they colour dark to light, so on and so forth. This just means they either use their dark colour first or their light colour first. In my case, I use my dark colour first, working through to my lights. Unless I'm doing a really big area or a more cartoony style image, then I might start with my lights first, but I tend to start with my darks first purely because I find it easier to put my shadow area or my shaded area in first and then work out from that. But I always put in slightly less of an area than what I think because I go over it more than once, and on my second time's when I'll bring it out, because obviously if I go out too far the first time I lay the colour down, that's it, I can't take it. Okay, so you'll notice that the image in front of you has now got some coloured in sections. The reason you haven't seen this happening is because I just spent the last however many minutes colouring these areas and explaining how I was doing it, just to realise everything was out of shot. I'm just going to briefly show you what I mean by how I colour and colouring light to dark. I turn my image when I'm colouring, and you'll find most people do, and it is definitely something I would suggest because the way I colour is in flicks, whether I'm doing hair or clothes or whatever I'm doing, I colour in flicks, and what makes a difference between, say, this texture and this texture will be the way I blend it, but the actual how I lay the colour down is generally the same. And I flick in the direction that I think something is moving, laying, sitting, whatever it may be. So, you know, a dress is going downwards, so I'd flick down, or from the side here, it's going round her, so I'd flick round. The hair, I'd go with the hair. So to make that easier, I turn it. So basically my flick is always from down to up, but the image is turned so that it still goes in the right way for the image. And that's just, again, my preference. Everything's about preference, what you find easier, but that's definitely something I find easier. So basically I go from, like I said, from dark to light. I'm not going to go into a really in-depth how I shade, how I colour, how I'd add more depth or definition in, how I'd put my creases and folds in, or my textures in. This is more just about the basics of the movement of the pen, how or what order I'd lay the colours down in, what sort of effect that will start to give, and then obviously you work from there and you build from there. My intention is over the next few tutorials is to start showing exactly how I put the extra texture in, how I put the folds in, the creases in, them sort of things. So, but just basically what I mean by flick is I flick my darkest colour first, so where I think there'd be shade. So under her elbow here on her dress there would be some shade, and under this arm. I hope you can see what I'm doing. Everything's at a bit of a funny angle. My arm's actually sticking through the camera tripod at the moment. So you'll find that when I actually colour, normally I actually colour with a pen much straighter, like this. If you hold your pen straighter, you'll notice you can flick lighter, barely touching the paper, as opposed to like this, which seems to touch paper more. But if I hold the pen up like this, you can't really see what I'm doing. So I'm trying to show you what I'm doing. Then I add my next lightest shade. So my first colour was French Navy, this is the Aegean. And I'm kind of going over the colour, the first colour that I laid down, and just extending it a bit further. I don't always fully go over the colour before it. It depends how much you want to darken the colour before it. But I would suggest trying to get rid of your line between your two colours as much as possible. Not fully, because your lightest shade should do that for you, or your blender pen if that's what you decide to use instead. And then we move on to the lightest shade. And in this case I haven't got a fine nib on it, and that is purely because I want this to be my blender, so I want this to blend everything. So with this I will go over everything. I am still flicking and I am still going in the same direction, and I will just extend it perhaps past where that one is. Now if this was on, say, the sleeve or that, this area here that would be white, and I'm now using this, I would brush it very lightly into that, so it only lays this down very lightly. But basically I use this to blend all my colours. Okay, so as you can see, you've now got a start of a blend coming down. And then what I would do is I would go back in with my darker one, put the shade back. Maybe I'll go a bit around here where I hadn't before. So again, it's somewhere else that is adding a bit of shade and definition. But it might not be as dark as these bits that would really be dark because they're under her arms. And then I'll take my sky blue. Sorry, I'll take my Aegean because the sky blue probably isn't pulling it out enough. And I will again just lightly flick, pulling out the line of the darker shade where I think it needs to be. Then lighter again. Now, at this stage, I wouldn't necessarily use my lightest colour again, unless the area that I had here was too light for my liking, or there was still too much of a shadow, a shading line between them. I wouldn't use my lightest colour again, and the reason for that being is my lighter colour is the colour I'm using to blend. And because I'm using it to blend, it does what I call muddy the colours in together, so it really does mix them all in together. And at this stage, I've already mixed everything in together and laid down a nice base colour, and now I'm wanting to give it a bit of definition, i.e. it's shadowing and shading, so I don't want to muddy them all in together again, but I do want a smooth blend because it's close. So if there is still a bit of a faint blend line, obviously I might lightly go over that, very, very lightly, just to blend that line out, but I won't fully go over it all because I don't want to muddy any of this anymore. If I was colouring this properly now, obviously I would add more shading, I'd be putting some folds and creases in her dress, but this is just to show you really the basics of blending and moving colours into each other. And that's basically it. The main difference between clothes, metal, hair, different textures is how I blend it out. So like I say, so there I blended all over with a colour, I blended it quite in, and then I went back to define it. With hair, for example, you would, again, flicking motions, and the lighter the better. I don't know if you can see that. But flicking motions, again, next colour, next lightest colour, this time going out a little bit further, still leaving white. Again, the next lightest colour. This is really rough, so I do apologise, but hopefully in the next tutorials you'll get a bit more info on how to do the colouring. And then my lightest colour, but this time I really lightly flick it, so it's like barely touching the paper and just basically taking the white away. And again, I then go back and I'll build on that colour. Like I did with the clothes. And so on and so forth. Something else where you would want to blend it all in and smoothen it all out. With hair you don't. You want to leave some of that harshness in there because you want that to act as your definition as such. But then that's basically it. You'd basically build it up, and you might, you know, have slightly darker areas, and again you'd go back and you'd just build the darker areas up. But again, I'll cover this in another tutorial what you should look for, where you should be shading, etc, etc. It's just to give you an idea of the difference in the blending to create the difference in the textures. And that's basically it. The other thing I need to point out that's worth remembering when you start colouring, or when you're colouring, is I colour in sections where I can. So for example here, this image is quite nice because this would be a section, her arm would be a section, this bit of her cape here would be a section, her sleeve was a section, her hair's in different sections, her face is another section. And what I mean by section is there's a defining edge around the area that creates that section. And the reason I colour in sections rather than going all the way across the image, so i.e. colouring all of her dress and all of her cape in blue, or the colours that I'm going to do it, the reason I do it in sections is with alcohol markers, and it's different if you're colouring with pencils, but with alcohol markers, the idea is you're moving the ink around. So to blend, to mix, to anything, you're moving the ink around on the paper. So to get the ink to move around on the paper, it still needs to be wet. If your ink has dried, if I coloured, done my dark and then went off for 5 minutes and came back, that would be too dry really for me to blend. I could go over it again with my dark and I could blend it in it a bit, but it's not, you know, it's not ideal. The idea is you work while your inks are as wet as possible. So really, you focus on a section, work on that section, and the idea is until you finish that section, don't stop. So try and make sure you're not disturbed while you're doing that one section. You'll also find that if you let your ink dry, you have to put more ink on, and the more ink you have to put on to make it wetter again, the more likely you are to get bleed or spread of your colours, because you're so oversaturating it. So the idea is light flicks, so you're only putting a little bit of ink on, you don't want to oversaturate it, but you need to work relatively quick and in sections so that you can work with wet ink. If an image, for example, like this one, this area here in his belly and his legs is quite a big area. So this is quite a small, it's quite a small image, but say he was blown up and you were colouring in bigger, this would become quite a big area to have to fill in. You know, you'd start from one side and go to the other, and you'd find that one side was drying out before you've laid down the next layer of colour. So in that case, and there's no defining black lines, you can still section it off in your head. So, you know, in your head, you've drawn a black line there, so this leg becomes a section. In your head, you can draw a black line there, so this becomes a section, and then this bit becomes a section. So you've now got one section has become 3, enabling you to work with it and keep your ink wetter whilst you're colouring. So that's what I mean by I section it off. And that's it really, that's the basics. They're the things that I'd watch out and look for. You can watch this video, I've also typed it all up in notes so you can print it out, look at the photos, look at the notes, keep the tips next to you so you can think, well, how would I do that, how would I do this? And I hope that you will come back for my next tutorials where actually we'll start to go into more detail of trying to get the different textures, hair, fur, clothes, metal, how I work out my light sources, how I add my shading in, an actual in-depth colouring rather than quick squiggles where I will actually colour a whole image, and at some points as well I'll do some projects and show you it all going together. So thank you for joining me.